Welcome to Module 5 of On the Ground, a closer look at organic dairy pastures, forages, and soils. This module is on inputs and materials that are used in organic crop production. My name is Sarah Flack, and I'm a consultant specializing in grass-based and organic livestock production systems. The goals for today's module is that we're going to learn how to read the National Organic Program's national list of allowed and prohibited materials for crop production. We won't be looking at livestock materials today for healthcare. We'll just be focusing on crop production materials. We'll also learn how to use the different types of lists of allowed and prohibited materials out there, such as the Omri List, the Organic Materials Review Institute, and also some of the certifier lists of materials. And then we'll also look at some product labels to determine if those products are allowed for use. Some more detail on the specifics of what we will cover today is we'll be looking at seeds and also seed treatments and inoculants. We will look at different types of fertilizers and soil inputs. We will look at silage inoculants, and then we'll also look at pesticides and herbicides. And again, the lists we'll be using today is the National Organic Program's National List, which is found in the Organic Standards. We'll look at the Omri List. Omri stands for the Organic Materials Review Institute, and then some of the other lists. We'll look at some product labels and learn a little bit more about what to look at in those labels. And then we'll also discuss what sorts of documentation that you should be trying to keep for your organic inspection. Before doing today's Module 5, it would be helpful for you to review Module 2, which we did in the first course in the Introduction to Organic Dairy Production. Module 2 in that was a summary of the National Organic Program standards, which would help you understand a little bit more of the big picture of the overall organic standards, since today we're really just going to be looking at the national list within the organic standards. Required reading for today is an article called "Can I Use This Input on My Organic Farm?" So let's talk a little bit about how the national list works. It is a list which includes the non-synthetic or natural substances if they are prohibited. So basically all of the natural materials are allowed unless they are specifically prohibited by being listed in the prohibited list. And then on the other hand, all synthetic, non-natural substances are assumed to be prohibited unless they are specifically allowed and on the allowed list of synthetics. The way the review of materials is supposed to happen is that all of the farmers are supposed to list all of the materials and substances that they think that they might be using on their farm in their OSP. The OSP stands for the Organic System Plan, and it also gets referred to as the organic application that gets sent into the certifier. And so each year the farmers are supposed to put the list of all of the materials in there, and then the certifier is supposed to review that list to make sure everything that the farmer has listed there is definitely allowed for use on an organic farm. So it's important for farms to keep that list up to date and notify their certifiers when they're adding new materials to that list so that this materials review can be happening all the time. So then the certifier needs to review all of those different materials on the list to make sure that they comply with the USDA organic standards and any other required standards. So the way the certifiers do these reviews is they'll go through the list of materials and they may look at the ingredients in each of those materials and then check those ingredients with the National Organic Standards national list, or they may be looking at the finished brand name product and seeing if they've already been reviewed by another third-party reviewing organization, and that could be another certifying organization, or it could be by the Organic Materials Review Institute, Omri. There's some detail about how this certifier review process needs to happen in a National Organic program policy memo, which is called Evaluation of Materials Used in Organic Crop, Livestock, and Handling Operations, that you can find on the NOP website. So here is a summary of Section 205.105 of the Organic Standards, which describes the allowed and prohibited substances, methods, and ingredients in organic production. And what this section says is, again, synthetic substances are prohibited unless they are specifically allowed on the national list. Natural substances are allowed unless they are specifically prohibited on the national list. And genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, are prohibited for use entirely, as is ionizing radiation and sewage sludge. So when materials are being reviewed to see if they're allowed for use on an organic farm or not, this is the general framework that certifiers or farmers need to be using to figure out if the stuff is allowed to be used. So the national list itself is in several sections, and it's found in subpart G of the Organic Standards. And the sections that we're going to be discussing today are 205.601. This is the list of synthetic substances allowed for use in organic crop production. And then we'll also briefly look at 205.602, which is the non-synthetic or natural substances which are prohibited for use in organic crop production. We won't be talking about some of the other sections in detail today relating to processed products or livestock healthcare products. So you can find the full national list on the NOP website, and I would encourage you to go and look at it because it does get updated somewhat regularly with changes in what's allowed, what's prohibited, and also some of the restrictions relating to some of the synthetics that are allowed. But just to give you some examples of some of the synthetic materials which are allowed, there are some soap-based herbicides which are allowed. Some insecticides are allowed. Those include insecticidal soap and horticultural oils. There are some synthetic soil amendments that are allowed, specifically micronutrients. But then there are also soil amendments such as liquid fish and aqueous plant extracts that are allowed. And it's important to note that some of these materials are subject to additional restrictions that are described on the national list. So now we'll look at 205.602, which is the non-synthetics that are prohibited for use in organic crop production. And so these are natural materials, but they cannot be used in crop production. And just two examples of what's on that list is you can't use ash from manure, which has been burned, and you can't use strychnine. And there's several other materials on that part of the prohibited list. So now, in addition to the National Organic Programs list, which we'll look at in a little bit more detail, I also want to mention the Omri List. Omri is the Organic Materials Review Institute, and they publish two booklets. This one is the Generic Materials List. So this is a list of basically the ingredients or the generic materials that are allowed. And then there are also some lists that are by brand name, one by Omri, and also there's a certifier list from the Washington State Department of Agriculture, which includes a brand name list of allowed materials. This is the Omri product list, so this is the book that you can look in if you are looking for brand names to see if the finished product by brand name is allowed or prohibited. And it's good to take a little time to read through these Omri books and see how they are organized, because they are sorted into different sections by crop materials, livestock materials, processing materials, and then also separated out by manufacturer, category, and brand name. This is an example of the section where the list of allowed seed treatments is in the Omri book. So they are listed under seed treatments in the crop materials section, and you can see there's a whole bunch of allowed seed treatments that have been reviewed by Omri. Some things are a little harder to find in the Omri book. This is just an example of where to find the silage inoculants, and they are actually listed under the livestock section, under management tools and production aids, and then under inoculants. So here you can see there's a list of some of the silage inoculants that organic farmers can use. So now let's take a quick look at the Washington State Department of Agriculture's Organic Program brand name list. This is available online and is continually updated. And so they list the brand names. They also, like the Armory List and the National Organic Program lists, also list the restrictions and some of the other detail about the materials. So here, this is the page where there is one of the silage inoculants, the micro-grow silage treatment here. Let's zoom in so that we can see the print a little bit more easily, so you can see the website of where you can go to the Washington State Department of Agriculture list if you want to look at this yourself. So now let's start looking at some of the product labels. We'll take a look at seeds and seed treatments, then we'll discuss fertilizers, silage inoculants, and then we'll look at some pesticides and herbicides. So before we look specifically at the national list and some of these labels, I just want to go back to 205, 204 in the organic standards, which is the seeds and planting stock practice standard, which describes that annual seedlings need to be organically grown, perennial transplants need to be organically grown for 1 year prior to harvest. In the case of seeds, organic seeds are required, but there is an exemption for commercial availability. So if the seeds are not available in the specific variety or quality that a farmer needs, then they're allowed to buy non-organic seeds. However, those seeds can't be treated with any prohibited materials, and they also can't be genetically engineered seeds. And any seed inoculants that are used need to be allowed. So when you're looking at the seed labels, if the seed is organic, it hopefully says so somewhere on the bag, and farmers need to be saving either the bag or some of the labels to show to the certifier and the organic inspector so that they can demonstrate that the seed actually was organic. And ideally, you want to save the really good documentation that shows not just that it's organic, but who the certifier is and some of the detail on it. So here's the actual seed tag, which has more useful information on it, because it says that it's organic seed, but then it goes on to specifically say certified organic by, in this case OCIA is the organic certifier. And so this is really great documentation to keep and show to your certifier to prove that you did actually buy organic seed. And here's another bag label that could be saved. In this case, it has the USDA organic logo on it and the name of the certifier. So this is more proof that these seeds are definitely allowed for use and they're certified organic. So then if there are any treatments on the seed, it's really important to make sure that those are allowed. And there are some seed treatments that are allowed. Many of them are prohibited. And some of them will actually say on the label, like this one does, that it is approved for organic use. And in this case, it doesn't have the Omri logo on here, but it does say Omri listed. And so this seed treatment would be allowed by the organic certifier. But again, it would be important for the farmer to have listed this in their organic system plan so that the certifier will have reviewed this material ahead of time and definitely approved it for use. Here's an example of a fungicide treated seed that would not be allowed. I think the part of the label here that describes what this treatment here is a little bit ripped off, but you can see that these seeds are a pink color. They've got a synthetic fungicide on them, which is prohibited since it's a synthetic and it's not on the list of allowed synthetics. So now we're going to move on to fertilizers. So let's again just jump back to 205, 203, which is the section of the organic standards on soil fertility and crop nutrient management practices. Just to summarize that section, it says that mined minerals are allowed, so those would be natural sourced minerals, but that mined minerals with high solubility may be subject to additional restrictions. And then it goes on to say that the synthetic fertility inputs that are on the national list are allowed, but they are also subject to restrictions. And then sewage sludge is prohibited, and any synthetic fertilizer that is not on the national list is prohibited, but that the natural non-synthetics, unless they are specifically prohibited, are allowed. So now let's look at the actual national list itself. This is just a small part of it. 205, 601, section J, and we're just looking at J1 through 7 here. But this is a list of some of the allowed fertilizers and soil fertility inputs. So you can see aquatic plant extracts are on here, but there's some specific restrictions on the type of those that are allowed. And just going down to number 6 here, micronutrients. They are allowed, but soil deficiency must be documented by testing. So if a farmer is going to use micronutrients, they need to have some tests to show to the inspector and the certifier that they really did have a deficiency of those micronutrients before they apply them. Manure is allowed. It's not on the list of prohibited natural materials as long as it is just the straight manure and it hasn't been burned and turned into a manure ash, which is actually prohibited. So this is an example of a product which is made from poultry manure, which is an Omri listed. You can see they've got the little Omri logo on this label. So this is a material that would be allowed for use. And then this is a compost pile made out of dairy manure, and this is allowed for use as long as it doesn't have any prohibited synthetic materials added to it. It does not need to come from an organic farm. It could come from an off-farm source, just as long as there's no synthetic additives added into the manure. So that's a material that's going to be allowed for use. Some of the fertilizers and soil amendments will be shipped to you with a copy of the Armory Certificate. So in this case, this product came with a Armory Certificate that lists the product name and it lists the company. And again, this is excellent documentation to keep on hand to show to your certifier or your organic inspector. The Omri Certificate is particularly helpful if you're buying in bulk materials and it's not coming with a label on a small 50-pound bag. So you've instead got large totes or tractor trailer loads of material. Then having some sort of documentation in the file to show the inspector is important, and this is a useful one to have if you can get it. And then there are also quite a few labels that you really are not able to tell whether it's going to be allowed or not from just looking at the label, because it doesn't give you quite enough detail. In this case, this is a blend of a lot of different types of fertilizers made into one master blend fertilizer. So it's got some fish in here, but we don't know exactly what type of fish it is. There's something called Compost T Plus that is made up of multiple ingredients, and then several other blends. And so this is a product where you're going to need to go back to the fertilizer salesman or manufacturer and get some additional detail from them on what this is made from. And then you'll need to send that information into the organic certifier to see if they can approve it to use on the farm. So you can't always tell everything from reading the label. So now let's look at some micronutrients. In this case, this is a boron material, and again, there is a restriction for use on this. So in order to use it, you're going to need to have some tests that show that you do indeed have some deficiencies before using the micronutrients. But in this case, you can see down on the bottom of this bag, this is an Omri listed material, and so your certifier is going to approve it for use, but there's going to be restrictions that you're going to need to meet in order to meet the organic standards. So that wraps up the discussion of soil amendments and fertilizers. Let's now look at silage inoculants. It's important to make sure you're using an approved formulation, because adding a non-approved silage inoculant to a batch of silage or haylage would result in that entire batch of silage not being allowed as organic feed for organic livestock. Some of these will have information on the label specifically saying that they are approved for organic use. This one doesn't specifically say that, but when we sat down and looked at this label, we could see that a lot of the ingredients are listed as organic ingredients. So they've used organically derived wheat midds and organically derived soybean meal here, along with some other organic products. So it seems pretty clear that this company was intending for this material to be approved for use by organic farmers, although it doesn't specifically say that on the label. And so in this case, you're going to want to take this label and submit it to the certifier so that they can approve it for use. unless you can find this specifically on one of the Omri lists or the Washington State Department of Agriculture list, in which case you can submit that information along with the label to the certifier, and that might speed up how quickly it gets approved for use on an organic farm. And so from reading this label, basically we can tell there's a pretty good chance that we're going to be able to use this in the organic silage, but we're not really sure yet until we hear back from the certifier. So now we're going to discuss disease and pest control and weed control materials. And it's important to go back to 205, 206 and know that before any pesticides or herbicides are allowed to be used, the farmer needs to show that they tried preventative practices and that only after those preventative practices didn't work did they then turn to actually using a pesticide or a herbicide. So you need to try all of the other practices and management practices on the farm before you start using these materials. So here is an insecticide label. This is Entrust, and this one has the Omri logo down on the bottom left of the label. So we know that the certifier is going to approve this one. So this still needs to go on the list of organic materials that you might want to use on your farm and send that into the certifier. But because it's got the Omri logo on here, we know that it's been approved for use by then, and then the certifier is probably going to approve it also. It's very important to look at these labels really carefully because there are multiple formulations of the same materials sometimes, and some of them are approved by Omri and some of them aren't. Or some of them may be approved by various organic certifiers, but others might not be, just from different ingredients in the different blends and types of pesticides. Here's a label which is a little harder to tell whether it's going to be allowed for use or not. This is Dipel, and it doesn't have the Omri logo clearly on the front label, but it does say in small print, kind of at the top right there, for organic production. So you can tell that this is the formulation that this company is intending get approved for use by organic farmers. And so you're going to want to turn this label over, see if there's an Omri or a different useful information on the back, and then submit all of this information to the organic certifier along with the list of all of the materials that you want to use on the farm. And that way it can be approved by the certifier ahead of time, even if it doesn't have the Omri logo on it. So now we'll look at a couple of herbicides. Some are prohibited. This is obviously a prohibited one, and we'll take a quick look at one of the allowed ones. So this is an Omri listed herbicide, and it's got the Omri logo right on it. One of the other things that's important to note is that many of these materials may get used with some sort of a spreader or a sticker material when it's being sprayed out on the plants. Those spreader stickers also need to be approved for use on an organic farm and also listed in the organic system plan that goes to the certifier for pre-approval. So I want to take a quick look back at section 205, 202 on land requirements in the organic standards, because not only do the materials used each season on a specific organic field need to be approved for use on an organic farm, but all of the materials within 3 years of the harvest of an organic crop need to be approved for use. So it's important to pay attention to materials during the transition process, during that 3-year transition process of the field, and make sure you're keeping records of what all the materials are and saving copies of all the labels and information so that the certifier knows for sure that everything that got used in that transition period were approved for use for organics. And it's also important to be paying attention to what's happening next to the field so that the buffer zones are wide enough to prevent any neighbor's use of prohibited materials from contaminating the organic field or the edges of the organic field, which would also slow down the process of being able to get that organic field certified or recertified. So just to summarize, looking at the process of understanding what is allowed and not allowed for use on organic farms, it's important to read the label and also keep copies of the label. Look for the Omri logo. That will make the approval process for materials much simpler. Look in the Omri list. Looking specifically at the brand name products list will be more useful, but also the generic materials list can sometimes be useful. Look on the Washington State Department of Agriculture list. If your certifier has a list, you can check there. And then, very important to make sure you list everything in the organic system plan and keep that list current. So if you want to add something to the list that isn't on there, you're thinking about using it this year, let your certifier know right away. And then also important to keep copies of all the labels, invoices, and ingredient documents for your inspector and certifier so that they know what you've been using is approved for use. And then keep in mind that even if it is approved for use, there may be some additional restrictions of how you're allowed to use it or additional documentation that you might need.